Oh hey, World Explorer, what magical place are you watching from? Maybe a beachside bungalow or a 32nd floor apartment? Let me know in the comments. Share the video like it's a secret recipe. Your support makes all the difference. Let's begin the fun. A brisk autumn breeze whisked across the ship's deck, carrying the clean tang of river water as Ian Talbot strode along the metal catwalk. He halted briefly at the railing, eyes fixed on the freighter carving a path through the placid Detroit River. The chill in the air made him consider heading below for his jacket. But first, he had someone to check on. He scanned the length of the massive ship, its steel form stretching nearly the entire length of a city block, hoping to catch sight of the younger crewman. But before he could locate Jack, something else drew his attention and brought a soft grin to his weathered features. To the side, nestled between Detroit on one bank and Windsor on the other, lay the tree-lined expanse of Belle Isle. From its shore, a group of children waved with unrestrained joy as the ship drifted past. Ian remained still, soaking in their exuberance. In that moment, those kids weren't thinking about cartoons or chasing monsters on screens. Their whole world was the vessel sliding past, and perhaps the people on it. He recognized that kind of pure, wholehearted wonder. Kids had a gift for that, living entirely in the now. As a father, he'd witnessed it himself. Grown-ups, he often thought, could learn from that. A voice called from behind, cutting through the wind. "Who you grinning at, Ike?" He turned slightly. Jack had joined him. "Just some kids on the island," Ian replied, his voice relaxed. Jack raised an eyebrow. "So why wave back?" Ian's smirk deepened. "Might mean more to them than you think. Sometimes a small gesture sticks with someone for life. Who knows? One of them might end up running this fleet. I just figure, treat folks the way you'd want them to treat you. Bad things come back around, but so do good ones." Jack nodded slightly, tugging his jacket closer. The wind was getting sharper by the minute. Cold, even for late October in Michigan. At least the skies hadn't turned yet. No snow for now. This state was notorious for its chaotic weather, 4 seasons in a week, or even a single afternoon. Locals liked to joke, "Don't like the weather? Just wait a bit." The freighter they served on was the Brock Mallory, hull number DQS-1. It measured 729 feet from bow to stern, 75 feet wide, and towered 38 feet above the river. At present, it carried over 25,000 tons of iron ore, bound for factories in Michigan and Wisconsin, where it would eventually be forged into truck frames and auto parts. "Damn, it's freezing," Jack muttered. This was only his 3rd trip aboard the Mallory, but he was starting to feel like part of the crew. He liked tossing out bits of maritime trivia when he could, hoping the older guys would stop seeing him as just a rookie. "If I didn't know better, I'd swear the—" he began, but his words cut off as Ian suddenly slapped a firm hand over his mouth. Ian leaned close, voice low but intense. "Don't say it," he warned. Jack's pulse spiked. There was something behind Ian's stare, something fierce, restrained, and dangerous. Usually Ian was all calm control, the kind of guy who let his strength simmer just under the surface. But now, he looked like a man you didn't cross. Jack nodded quickly, signaling he understood. He'd heard the stories, how sailors, or mariners, as they called themselves now, had their fair share of strange superstitions. On the Great Lakes, those beliefs were still deeply rooted. Jack thought it was nonsense. In a world of radar, GPS, and satellite data, who still clung to ancient sailor myths? Maybe that was just the difference in age. Ian was pushing 50. Jack had just turned 24. They'd grown up in completely different eras. The only thing they really shared was the job. Both were deckhands on the same ship. Their personal lives couldn't have been more opposite. Jack bounced from port to port, chasing temporary flings and short-lived thrills. Ian had been with the same woman, Tara, since before Jack was even born. Their relationship wasn't smooth. Jack had overheard enough shouting matches to know that. But it had endured. He couldn't understand why Ian stuck it out. If love looked like that, he wanted no part of it. It seemed like more of a burden than a bond. Ian, on the other hand, believed love was the very reason you endured. Jack didn't buy it. Why fight for something that only seemed to bring pain? But what really confused him was Ian's devotion to old sailor lore, warnings and curses passed down like gospel. Jack dismissed anything that couldn't be tested or proven. Science and reason were his compass. Anything others called a ghost could usually be explained by tech or psychology. Still, he couldn't shake the memory of how quickly Ian had shut him down, how alarmed he'd been when Jack nearly said it. A word, that's all it was. He'd almost called something what it was. A witch. That was the word, a simple, stupid word. He mouthed it silently now, defying the fear. Witch, 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 Jack murmured under his breath as Ian disappeared down the path. To hell with that witch. Next chapter. Jack's voice barely broke the silence, yet the air didn't simply swallow the words. Instead, they drifted to the river's edge, mingling with the churning current. Carried along on the water's relentless course, the muttered phrase wound its way into the vast basin of Lake Huron. The waters moved on, pushing into the St. Mary's River, threading through the Sioux Locks, and ultimately emptying into the cold immensity of Lake Superior. By surface area, Superior reigns as the largest freshwater lake in the world. Poets and songwriters, from Longfellow to Lightfoot, have honored it under various names, including Gitchigami, the storied Great Water. Whatever title it wears, the lake remains titanic, unpredictable, and steeped in enigma. Some regions plunge so deep and remain so frigid that they've never known the grip of ice. According to legend, the Great Lakes are more than natural features. They're sentient beings, ancient and willful. Their tempers and sorrows have filled many a tale. But Jack's trouble didn't stem from these primeval lake spirits. What stirred wasn't ancient in the traditional sense, but it was no less old in essence. At the lake's bitterest point, a region so frigid and remote it had earned the nickname Icewater Mansion, his quiet curse brushed against something dormant. His words, though soft, carried power, and they were enough. The thing below stirred from its deep slumber. A thin hiss escaped from its lips, and glowing eyes, sharp and blue as fractured ice, snapped open. A single, fluid gesture of its arm sent a brutal wind skimming across the surface, spiraling downward into the depths. This burst of force did not go unnoticed. It roused another, the lake's overseer, known only as the Supreme. Her voice, deep and fluid like the sea itself, rang out across the water. "Back to sleep, little sister. Your hour has not yet struck." But from far beneath a reply came, restless and firm. "Something calls to me. I can't ignore it." The wind surged stronger. The churning whirlpool widened, pulling her toward the top. Thunder cracked in the heavens. Bolts of lightning split the sky and slammed into the waves. As her corpse breached the surface, bloated from decades but eerily whole, the wind howled tighter around it, forming a vortex. That storm pulled the lake's water from her body, draining it until only the preserved shell remained. The same water that had kept her intact for 31 years now relinquished its hold. And in that moment, the wind claimed her. The spirit took hold of the empty body, animating it. Now she had form, tangible, visible. Yet she remained tethered to her true nature, belonging more to mist and motion than to flesh and bone. For countless ages, the partnership between wind and water had shaped coastlines and carved destinies, though their true purpose often remained obscure, even to them. Superior herself had devoured ships and souls without even being aware of it. This amused the wind spirit. A smirk curved her borrowed lips. She whipped her head violently, with such force that a human neck would have snapped. Her eyes blazed with eerie purpose. Though the body had once belonged to someone, Sierra Ellen Hale, its memories still flickered faintly in her mind, like embers refusing to die. Why those echoes lingered was unclear. She didn't care. She was no longer Sierra Ellen. The name persisted in her mind like a ghost, but it meant nothing now. She had become something new. She was November. To mortals, she had always been November, the November witch. A harbinger, a storm embodied, a walking omen. But for over 3 decades she had walked among them for a purpose they had never guessed. And not a soul had suspected her mission. Gazing out over the expanse of Gichigami, now calm again, she felt a tug. A magnetic pull drawing her toward the shoreline, where Huron's waters lapped against the earth. She knew that sensation. She understood what it promised. But before she could answer the call, she had to feed. To hell with the witch, indeed. Next chapter. In truth, most modern cars came equipped with a limited slip rear differential. So Caleb couldn't quite understand why some manufacturers still insisted on that old-school axle design. Just a steel shaft with wheels at each end. Not that it really bugged him. His car had its quirks, sure, but that's what made it special. Flaws gave things personality. He'd never known a flawless human, so why expect that from a hunk of metal? His musings were interrupted by the crunch of tires in the driveway. Sounded like Renee's car. Caleb slid out from under the chassis, wiped the grease from his fingers, and stepped inside just in time to catch his wife, tall, elegant, and perfectly groomed, disappearing up the stairs into their ensuite. Same pattern every evening. Without a word, she went straight to the shower the moment she arrived home. He found it odd. How much stress could a secretary really be under that she needed a shower before anything else? This wasn't the life he'd imagined when they tied the knot. And he never understood why she wanted the job at all. Caleb earned more than enough to keep them both more than comfortable. His 6-figure salary saw to that. In fact, her work cost them more than it paid. She didn't make enough to justify the wardrobe he kept buying for her so she'd look the part. He'd pointed this out more than once. Between the upscale clothes, the wear and tear on her car, fuel costs, and her daily habit of lunching at that trendy downtown bistro, her paycheck barely scratched the surface. Still, she wouldn't quit. He liked that she was independent, at least in theory. But lately, her commitment to the job felt less like independence and more like defiance. They hadn't yet reached their 2nd anniversary, and already the closeness they once shared had begun to decay. Caleb was head over heels for Renee. From the first moment he saw her, he was captivated. It was as if he handed her his heart without conditions, trusting her to do whatever she wished with it. He wasn't unattractive, not by a long shot, but he wasn't anyone's idea of a heartthrob either. He half expected her to shatter him and walk away with a smirk. At the very least, he figured she'd let him down gently and move on to someone smoother. So when she actually reciprocated his feelings, sincerely, or so it appeared, he was nothing short of stunned. Their romance had ignited quickly, intense from the outset. 3 months in, they were engaged. By 6, they were married. Now they were both quietly unraveling. It hadn't been simple. Lately, Caleb felt more warmth from his vehicle than from his own spouse. He knew it would take him a few more days before he could bring himself to look her in the eye again. Sooner or later, though, something would have to give. He had his doubts. He suspected someone at her work was more than just a colleague. He'd followed the usual steps, hired someone to look into it, kept his eyes peeled for clues. The final report was due in a few days. But what then? What if his fears were confirmed? The macho move would be to throw her out on the spot, send her packing, make her face the consequences. Maybe even lash out on her, on the man she was sneaking around with. The kind of thing someone like John Wayne would have done. But Caleb wasn't a cowboy. Sure, he wasn't one to let people walk all over him, but this was different. He cared about Renee deeply, more than he could explain. Even after just 2 years, the idea of life without her was unbearable. Part of him wished confronting her might somehow convince her to give up the affair. Just lying next to her at night, even when she claimed she was too tired, still beat the thought of sleeping alone. Better that than pretending to fall for someone else. There was a part of him that ached for her love to match his. Another part that wished he'd never met her. But either way, their story was coming to a close. He exhaled heavily and turned back to the engine he'd been tinkering with. Earlier that day, she had spent hours in a cheap motel room with 3 men she didn't know. Afterwards, she'd scrubbed every inch of herself, meticulous, thorough, making sure Caleb wouldn't pick up even a trace of what she'd been doing. Truthfully, the best thing Caleb had to offer was his house. Tucked away behind the gates of a private neighborhood, it was the perfect refuge. especially after the mess she'd narrowly escaped in a bogus insurance scheme not long before they met. That was 2 years ago, and the heat had long since cooled off. She was nearly done digging through Caleb's assets, close to draining his accounts clean. Once she left, just a few more days, she'd be walking away with close to 7 figures in cash and investments. Caleb's greatest asset in her mind was how steady and dependable he was. Being with him made her realize the old cons, phony policies, staged thefts were too risky and messy. This, by comparison, was effortless. Find a man with money and a soft heart. Make him fall hard, marry him, lie low, and when the timing was right, disappear. It had gone off without a hitch. And while she never truly loved him, she couldn't say she felt nothing. She didn't want to cause him more pain than necessary. Renee wasn't made for love, not the kind people dream about. And Caleb? He'd come closer than anyone ever had. The affection she held for him was more like what one might feel for a loyal pet, familiar, comforting, but not consuming. "Caleb!" she called, moving through the house. Silence. Where was he hiding now? As she wandered from room to room, a sudden wave of melancholy hit her. She would actually miss this place. Caleb had done everything he could to make this sprawling home feel like her retreat. She'd never had anything like it. No place had ever truly felt hers. Her eyes landed on the framed photos lining the shelves, snapshots of them together in exotic places, all smiles and embraces. They looked like a couple in love. Only she knew those pictures were just part of the act, scenes carefully composed to reinforce the illusion. Then came a soft clatter, metallic and distant, from somewhere behind the kitchen. She knew instantly. He was in the garage, likely elbows deep in his prized car, what she often teased as his real wife. She wondered, if it came down to it, who he would choose, her or the machine. "Caleb," she said again, cracking open the door that led to the garage. He was crouched beneath the chassis, hands busy with tools, but he turned at the sound of her voice. The moment their eyes locked, she saw it in his face. He'd figured it out. Her instincts, sharp from years of deception, told her that something had shifted. She didn't know what exactly he'd learned, but it was enough to change everything. Their time was almost up. "Hey, baby," she said sweetly, her voice smooth like honey. "I've been thinking about you all day." She leaned against the doorframe, drawing closer. "It's been a few days since we—" "I'm kinda tired," he cut in, eyes returning to his work. That was all she needed. He knew, and that look on his face, it wasn't just sadness. It was heartbreak, it was envy. He couldn't shake the suspicion that she was playing a game with him. He briefly considered hiring someone to follow her, track her whereabouts, dig around a little. But too much digging might turn up things she had no intention of letting surface. No, she had to disappear, tonight. The timing wasn't right to cash out completely. She'd have to be satisfied with a few $100,000, at least for the moment. Luckily, her backup plan was about to fall into place. Her old friend was sailing back into port today, a seasoned mariner who valued silence and discretion. If she handled him properly, he'd help her vanish without a trace. They'd already had a reckless adventure on the luxury boat. He technically wasn't supposed to let her on. She'd started to say, "But darling, wouldn't you rather—" A glimmer of hope stirred in her. Maybe she could still steer things her way. If she played it smart, she might buy herself a few extra weeks, just enough time to reach the final payout. Honestly, she wasn't quite ready to walk away from Caleb. He might have been naive, but his loyalty ran deep. No one had ever cared for her the way he did. She had a feeling she'd miss him more than she missed the life she was abandoning. She cast a wounded, sorrowful look in his direction, as though he'd deeply hurt her. Her act was flawless. He was already beginning to falter. It almost made her laugh how skilled she'd become. And then his phone buzzed. He gave her a sheepish smile. "Sorry, I've got to take this." She knew Caleb like a well-worn script. She'd molded him so thoroughly, he rarely kept anything from her. Usually, he'd take work calls right in front of her without a second thought. But this time, he stepped away. That left only two possibilities. Either he was keeping something from her, or the call was about her. Sure, it might be an innocent surprise, but she couldn't take that risk. Assuming the worst was her safest bet, and this didn't feel like good news. As he turned his back, cupping the phone with his hand, she moved closer. She kissed his cheek tenderly, then slipped out of the room without a sound. Letting the door close with a gentle click, she strolled into the kitchen and let a frying pan fall. The clatter rang through the house. Perfect. He'd assumed she was just making lunch. She returned to the hallway and paused by the door he'd left cracked. Inside, his voice was hushed, but she caught fragments, photos, recordings. She couldn't make out everything, but the pit in her stomach told her what she needed to know. Back in the kitchen, she casually made a sandwich. When he returned, she greeted him with a warm smile. "Want one too?" He shook his head. "Maybe later. We need to talk when I get back." She nodded sweetly, radiating warmth. "I love our chats, baby," she cooed, eyes gleaming. "I'll be right here." Her face glowed with affection, sincere on the surface. He left, sliding into the Mustang and tearing out of the driveway. Damn it, she thought. If only he'd taken a different car. She'd have gladly stolen that one. As soon as his taillights disappeared around the corner, she sprang into action. Outfit changed, purse stocked with a few of his credit cards. He used the same passcode for everything, a gift, really. Once those were secure, she turned to the safe. He always kept $10,000 to $20,000 in cash just in case. Right beside it were several CDs, easily converted to money. She used her own cards to seed a bank account, then drove to a neighboring town and liquidated the CDs. She walked away with nearly $100,000. Not bad for a fallback, but it still wasn't the windfall she was aiming for. The real money was locked behind accounts she hadn't cracked, yet. That's where the Ferrari story came in. She'd charmed the bank officer into believing she was planning a surprise, a gleaming sports car for Caleb's birthday. It worked on two fronts. First, it made the banker think Caleb was special enough for such a gift, and maybe she'd toss a little gratitude his way too. Second, it threw Caleb off the scent. He'd never suspect she knew he'd already earmarked those funds for something else. By the time the car was scheduled to arrive, she'd be long gone. Time to move on. Another target, another strategy. Still, part of her would regret this one. Caleb had truly loved her, and despite everything, she wasn't entirely heartless. They would bounce back. In time, both of them would heal. In a strange, backward way, she was doing him a favor. He was finally getting the wake-up call he hadn't known he needed. Now he knew better. He'd have to wise up, not just with his finances, but more importantly, with his heart. Next chapter. Caleb lowered himself into the chair across from his private investigator, Frederick Sanford. "Please sit down, Mr. Drayton," Sanford said, motioning toward the seat opposite him. Sanford's face told stories, a toughened veteran who'd left the military for the equally gritty world of private investigation. He'd dealt with every scenario imaginable, husbands who treated infidelity like a bad habit, and wives who'd been forgiven so many times their affairs became part of the marriage's silent agreement. He suspected Caleb was that second type, a man so wrapped up in love, he was willing to be blind to betrayal. And frankly, with a woman like hers, Sanford couldn't entirely blame him. Still, this part of the job never got easier. Informing a man that the woman he adored saw him as little more than a temporary stop on her path. "Mr. Drayton," Sanford began, his voice slow and deliberately heavy, "I've got some difficult news to share." That somber tone? It was part of the job. It made clients feel understood, and clients who felt understood often opened their wallets wider. "She's definitely stepping out on you," Sanford went on. "But if there's any consolation, it's that she's not limiting herself to just one guy. That's actually better." Caleb frowned, puzzled. "I don't follow. Wouldn't it be less bad if it were just one guy?" "Absolutely not," Sanford replied without hesitation. "That's when it's serious. If she's attached to just one man, chances are there's something deeper going on. Feelings, maybe love. And that?" He shook his head. "That's a hell of a lot harder to undo. But if she's just bouncing around, chasing highs, sleeping with whoever, that's not about love. That's about validation, attention. And believe it or not, sometimes they still have feelings for their husbands." Sanford leaned in slightly. "When you're with her, how does she act toward you?" Caleb paused. "Honestly, she's warm, affectionate, like seeing me makes her genuinely happy. There it is, Sanford said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. Here's what you do. Go home, lay these on the table. Don't speak. Just let the silence do the talking. Let her sweat. Let her think you're out the door. Then, and only then, bring up therapy. Something loosened in Caleb's chest. He grabbed the envelope, tucked it under his arm, and walked out with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Next chapter. After hours of unloading cargo, Jack flopped down on his bunk, exhausted. The work was brutal, the kind that drained every muscle in your body. He figured he had a bit of time to recover before calling Melissa, the woman he met up with whenever their ship hit this port. She was older, strikingly beautiful, and married, none of which ever gave Jack pause. Sure, the ship had a crane that handled the heavy lifting, but that didn't spare the crew. Deckhands like him still had to sort and haul cargo until their bodies ached. Today they'd unloaded 13,000 tons of pellets, only to turn around and load the same amount of raw castings. Both shipments were bound for Wisconsin. The vessel would be sailing out at first light. That gave Jack one night to unwind. They had a longer layover on the return trip, 3 days. Maybe then they'd have a proper date. Tonight? Tonight was for tension release. "Jack, there's a lady here asking for you," called Carl Jones from the hallway. Carl was another hand on the crew, not much longer on the ship than Jack himself. He had a reputation. Not evil, exactly, but careless in a way that made people double-check their valuables when he was near. Rules for Carl were more like suggestions. The only ones he obeyed were the ones he knew he couldn't wiggle out of. "You want me to send her to your cabin?" Carl asked, smirking. "Are you out of your mind?" Jack snapped. "The captain'll hang us." "He's not on board," Carl replied, grin widening. "He's ashore. What he doesn't know won't kill him." Jack stretched, cracking his neck. "All right, fine. Send her in." 10 minutes later, Renee, the woman Jack knew as Melissa, was lying in his bed, doing everything she could to win him over. Jack liked to think he was unforgettable in bed, that she was so obsessed she'd waited at the dock all day for a single night with him. But Renee had an agenda. She needed Jack to get her to Wisconsin, immediately. She was certain Caleb and his investigator were circling in, connecting dots, especially about the money she'd taken. Sure, Caleb had money to lose, but the amount she'd stolen, enough to guarantee serious prison time if she were caught. And something about Jack tonight unsettled her. The shift in his energy was subtle, but she picked up on it right away. Something colder in his gaze, something distant in his voice. Jack didn't want intimacy. He wanted distraction, pleasure without strings. And for Renee, that realization stung more than she'd expected. He had taken everything he wanted from her, and now she was nothing but an afterthought. She found herself cornered with no clear escape. Disappearing without a trace had suddenly become her only option. She should have waited until they were further out at sea. Now, trapped and powerless, she had nothing left to offer but a recycled version of what he'd already claimed. Only now did it hit her how recklessly she'd behaved. She'd betrayed a man who had once adored her, truly, deeply. And what had she gained in return? A few crumpled bills. But it had never been about the money. He had always given her whatever she asked for, no questions. Caleb was everything most women dream of, handsome, affluent, endlessly generous. What more could she have possibly wanted? 30 was looming on the horizon, and she was getting too old for this. Running, scheming, dodging accountability. Maybe it was time to slow down, build something stable, something real. It was too late to undo what had already been done, but maybe, just maybe, she could walk away from this life of crumbs and shadows. "I missed you so much, Jack," she said, every word a polished lie. Jack yawned and glanced at his wristwatch. "I'd hate to make you late, babe," he said casually. Babe, the word made her stomach turn. He probably couldn't even recall the fake name she'd given him. And truth be told, neither could she. "What's my name, Jack?" she asked, her tone sharp and cold. He stammered, caught off guard. Her stare was enough to freeze fire. "Melissa," he blurted out. "Of course. I just always call you baby. Jack, can I stay with you? She asked gently. I don't want to be apart again like last time. She made her voice sound fragile, like she might shatter without him. I'll see what I can do, he said, hesitating. But you've got to be super quiet, super careful. If anyone finds out, I'm screwed. I mean, how would you even eat? Or go to the bathroom? Don't worry about that, Jack, she purred. All I care about is being near you. Renee was setting the same trap she'd used before. A ship full of men posed no real obstacle. The trip to Wisconsin would barely take 3 days, even if they crawled the whole way. She just needed a hidden spot and the right moment. Of course, Jack had his own angle. Besides, her husband had money. If she played her cards right, she might even get Jack a job out of it. He wasn't like Ike. Jack wasn't built for breaking his back on the docks day after day. Okay, baby, Jack finally said. Let's try it. Grab your things and meet me back here in 3 hours. Same place as before. You won't regret this, she said, flashing a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. 3 hours would be plenty. She had already drained as much as possible from Caleb's account at the bank. Now it was just a race to hit every ATM in town before the daily limits kicked in. Cash, CDs, even a few bonds. She was locked and loaded. Still a whisper echoed in her mind. Quiet, but persistent. You don't have to do this. He truly loves you. He'll take you back. You could start over. She silenced the thought with a mental shove. That wasn't her way. Her life had always been a chase, grifting, running, surviving. Reinvention wasn't in her DNA, and maybe, just maybe, she didn't even know how. Next chapter. Jack pushed open the worn door of a riverside dive called Sailor's Hands. The scent hit him immediately, stale beer mixed with damp wood. He scanned the bar, 2 guys leaning over a pool table, another group around the dartboard, and a tight crowd glued to a battered TV showing a Red Wings game. Detroit took its sports more seriously than any place he'd ever been. Even New York didn't breathe sports the way this city did. The Red Wings were dominating the NHL. The Tigers were locked in an ALCS slugfest with the Rangers, fighting for a shot at the World Series. The Lions had stormed into the season, starting off 4-0, 8 straight wins in the regular season, 12 if you counted preseason. Even college soccer was a big deal. Michigan versus Michigan State had just gone down last weekend. It didn't matter what sport it was. In this city, everything was a big game. The only team struggling was the Pistons. Sailor's Hands wasn't the kind of place you went for ambiance. The wood paneling was scratched and water-stained, the bar stools uneven, the floor long overdue for replacement. No kitchen to speak of, just cheap booze and frozen snacks that barely counted as food. Most of the regulars were sailors, men who lived their lives on the water, toiling across the Great Lakes. The regulars never bothered with appearances. There was no reason to. Women rarely walked through the door. And when they did, it was usually to find some drunk husband or drag one home before he lost his eyesight to the bottom of a glass. Even then, they didn't linger. You could tell the place rejected them. Like something in their bones knew they weren't welcome here, which made it all the more unreal when the door slammed open like it had been kicked by the wind, and she appeared in the entryway, framed by moonlight like a figure out of a dream. For a second, she stood still in the doorway. Then she stepped in, and the shift in the room was instant. A few men got up and left without saying a word. She didn't look at anyone, but every gaze tracked her like a needle to a magnet. Behind her, the wind gave a mournful cry, and someone fought to get the door shut against the gale. Jack watched. He didn't look away, didn't even pretend not to stare. There was something about her, something raw and jarring. Her hair was a tangled mess of dark curls, as if she'd just stepped out of a squall. But the sky outside had been clear. Maybe she'd been washing down a trawler, or hosing something off, something wet. She was rail-thin, almost ghostly, and her eyes had a depth that made Jack uneasy. He'd never stood this close to someone like her before. She walked straight toward him, stopped, tilted her head, examining him like a specimen on a slide. Then, out of nowhere, she smiled. Her clothes looked like they'd survived decades, untouched by detergent or fashion. She dressed like someone caught in the wrong decade, maybe two. Jack figured she was either completely broke, a streetwalker, or maybe both. Whatever her deal was, she was interesting, and new. He flashed his best grin. Around them, a couple old-timers crossed themselves. Sailors and their damn superstitions. Probably thought women in seafaring bars brought doom, just like the old tales about bad luck aboard ships. Didn't stop Jack from sneaking Melissa onto the Mallory more than once. Nothing ever came of it. That's when he noticed what looked like a necklace, except it wasn't metal or beads. It was lakeweed twisted and looped around her neck. Weird. She was probably one of those environmental nuts trying to make a statement. Jack reached for her hand and led her to a nearby table. The contact jolted him. Her skin was like ice, and her scent was off. Not bad, almost familiar, but just beyond recognition. "What brings you out here, sweetheart?" he asked. "You," she said. Jack's grin widened. Too easy, he thought, like pulling trout from a barrel. Less than 10 minutes later, she was tugging his hand, guiding him toward the exit. They didn't need to discuss price. Both of them knew what they were leaving for. As the wind fought them at the door, he thought he heard someone whisper, "Witch." He laughed under his breath. Old men and their stories. "Where are we headed, beautiful?" he asked. Her hand tightened around his, tighter than it should have. It actually hurt. The river, which had been calm earlier, now rolled with sharp, erratic waves. It looked like a storm cloud had parked directly above them. But when he scanned upriver and down, the water stilled again in both directions. Whatever was stirring the surface, it was following them. He'd heard of micro-weather patterns, but this didn't feel like weather. She pointed to a small dinghy bobbing at the end of a battered pier. It was barely secured, as if it might break loose at any moment. "I'm not climbing into that scrap heap in this mess," he said. "Afraid?" she asked, flashing another smile. "No," he snapped. "I'm just not in the mood to die tonight." She seemed amused. Her smile widened, and just like that, the wind died. The river smoothed out in seconds. Now it was barely more than a whisper across the surface. "Just a gust," she said, voice light as feathers. "We get those around this time of year." She paused, then added, "But you're a sailor. You know how these things go." "Sure I do," Jack said, lying. "If a little boat's too much for you, we can call it off," she said with mock sweetness. "Race you," he called back. But a shiver ran through him as he glanced at the dinghy. Not fear, exactly. Something older, something primal. But it melted away when he saw her already lounging in the boat's bow. Funny thing was, he hadn't seen her climb in. She'd been walking ahead of him a second ago, and now there she was, reclined like she'd been waiting for hours. Had the wind lifted her in? Number couldn't be. He shook it off. If he kept letting his imagination run, he'd end up like those old dock hands with their haunted tales and sea curses. Jack stepped onto the worn dock, climbed into the boat, and locked eyes with the woman who would be his for the night. He moved toward her, unthinking, ready. He noticed the smile stretching across her face, a little too wide, maybe. "Jack," she said, her voice warm and inviting, "I really do like you." That caught him off guard. Had he ever told her his name? He must have, though he couldn't remember when. "I felt a pull toward you even before I ever saw you," she added almost dreamily. Jack burst out laughing. Lines like that were usually his go-to move, not the other way around. But there was something else. Her voice. It didn't sound quite like it had before. "How could you have felt anything for me before you even saw me?" he asked, unease crawling back up his spine. That weird feeling he'd shaken off earlier, that vague digital age paranoia, was creeping in again, stronger than before. Even his own voice seemed off now, not quite how it should sound. Maybe something strange was happening acoustically. Some weird echo or interference warping their voices. He glanced around. The boat had floated far from shore, just a speck now against the busy flow of the river. In daylight, a shout might have gotten them help. But now, with the sun long gone and autumn's cold settling in, rescue felt like a long shot. Her voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts. A sudden cold settled around him like a second skin. The wind had turned sharp and steady, and the once placid river had begun to stir. Gusts tore across the water, making the surface churn and ripple. "It was something you said," she murmured. "Your words, they brought me back." She lifted her gaze toward the stars. "It's still October 30th, isn't it? I was supposed to sleep for 2 more weeks. That's what you call them, right? Weeks? Yeah, 2 more weeks, that's what I was owed. But now," she said, her tone growing heavier, "there's a cost. Just like those old tales you people pass around, Jack. That cursed song, I hate that song more than anything." Her lips curled slightly as she said it, bitterness flickering behind her expression. "That tune reminds me of the choice that changed everything, turned me into what I am." Jack instinctively inched away from her. Her eyes, there was a glow in them, but it didn't come from any moonlight. It radiated from within her, something deeply wrong, deeply unnatural. He prayed she'd keep speaking, just long enough for someone to spot them. Patrol boats and the Coast Guard sometimes passed through at night. If he could stall her, if he could just hold on. He was a decent swimmer. If help got near, he could dive in and go for it. "What song are you talking about?" Jack shouted, more forcefully than he intended. His heart was hammering, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "What kind of legend are you spinning here? I don't even believe in that ancient folklore garbage." "I don't remember the title," she said, her voice nearly drowned in the rising wind. "My sisters and I, we've been around for over 10,000 years. Plenty of songs have been written about storms, drowning, restless spirits. But that one song, that one got it right. It was the reason I accepted this form 30 years ago. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks, but Jack thought he could hear a faint melody floating in the distance. A slow, haunting tune, something that would drift from a lonely AM radio and leave you hollow. He strained to make out the words. Something about the lake refusing to release its dead when November's wrath arrived early. Yeah, he knew that one. Never learned the name of the artist, never cared. But now, that old song felt like it had swallowed his entire reality. He had to change the subject. "But that's not why you were drawn to me, right?" His voice trembled. This wasn't charm anymore. It was a plea for survival. The water had turned chaotic, barely any boats daring to cross it now. Moments ago it had been still. What had caused the shift? "No, Jack," she said softly, the wide grin making its return. "It was the beauty in your voice, the way you spoke. That's what woke me. That's what called me to you." "What did I say?" he asked, panic creeping into every syllable. "Whatever it was, I take it back. I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't mean a thing." He began murmuring prayers under his breath. "Oh God, please, Jesus, help!" From the bow of the boat, the woman let out a low, amused laugh. "God doesn't punch in for night shifts, Jack," she said, grinning wider. "It's just the two of us now." The wind howled again, bringing with it unearthly sounds that defied explanation, like voices riding the waves just out of reach. That sorrowful tune drifted on through the darkness, a mournful dirge that seemed to play solely for him. Where does mercy go when time is stretched thin by crashing waves and every second feels like forever? "Please, just hear me out!" Jack yelled, his voice breaking with panic. The howling wind devoured his words, but he knew she'd heard him. "What did I say? What did I do to rouse you?" "You already know, Jack," she called back, her voice rising in tandem with the gale. "Don't you remember calling out for me again and again?" To hell with the witch, he had spat once. And in that moment, it hit him. His fate was sealed. Her features contorted, slipping from human to something far older. A visage untouched by time, older than scripture, older even than gods. She wasn't merely within the storm now. She was the storm. She was the November witch. In an instant, the tempest seized him, yanking him from the deck and lifting him into the air. The atmosphere gripped him like a vengeful hand, suspending him in a chaos of wind and silence. Beneath him, the river churned violently. The wind lashed the surface into towering sprays, slamming water against the shore with such fury that sand spun like knives, flaying his skin raw. He screamed, the agony carving itself across his body like burning blades. "Why scream, Jack?" she asked, her voice filled with glee, high and piercing. Her amusement chilled him deeper than the pain ever could. Because it hurts, damn it, he shouted. Try getting torn apart by some lunatic made of air. Drowning would be a mercy. Even as the words escaped, he knew he'd made a mistake. The wind vanished, and Jack fell. The freezing water engulfed him like a sealed coffin. His battered skin pulsed with agony before going numb. The cold wasn't just surface deep. It invaded him, freezing him from the inside out. His limbs stopped obeying him. He tried to swim, to move anything, but it was futile. Then something clutched his ankle. He jerked in panic, eyes wide, twisting underwater to see. Terror punched the air from his lungs. Bubbles rushed upward as he gasped in horror. It hadn't been a rope. It hadn't been a snag. It had been her. The witch had him, dragging him down through the black water toward the silt-covered floor. As the edges of his vision darkened, he saw her, serene and monstrous, seated on a submerged stone like a ruler on her throne. She gazed at him with cool detachment, as if watching reruns of a show she'd seen 100 times. The plot changed, but the ending never did. Jack felt his essence begin to tear free from his flesh. This wasn't simply death, it was erasure. His memories peeled away like layers of old paint. When his lungs screamed for air, his childhood faded. When icy water filled his chest, his teenage years disappeared, along with his very name. It was a death without dignity, beyond pain. He could have handled dying. But wasn't there supposed to be something? A final glimpse of his life? A parade of faces he loved, moments that defined him? There was nothing but emptiness. He fought to remember his name as it slipped through his grasp. And then she tensed. The witch halted, head whipping around sharply. Something had disrupted her. With a low, animalistic hiss, she recoiled, and with abrupt motion, shot toward the surface, vanishing into the air above. Jack didn't even notice. Next chapter. At the edge of the river, a tall figure stood, dressed head to foot in black leather. His gaze cut across the boiling waters, and the moonlight shimmered in his sharp eyes. "Cadino Hysis!" he shouted, voice echoing like thunder. "Come forth or be cast out." Without a sound, Noia Brina emerged from the river, soaring upward as if gravity held no claim on her. She laughed, a sound like glass splintering. "I'm busy. Can't this wait?" "This isn't your territory," the man said coldly. "Return to your realm. Let the boy go and depart, or I'll drive you back myself." The wind wrapped around her like a living cloak. Her laughter turned wild and sharp. "You think you can dismiss me, little shaman?" she mocked. "Push much harder, and I'll leave you in pieces." "You're no match for your ancestors," she added with scorn. "They had power that flowed with the rivers and earth. Yours, corrupted, thinned out by settlers and their kin." "Speaking my name won't help you," he said, unshaken. "It just tells me you've been paying attention." "And Jack?" She grinned as the boy's limp form rose, bobbing on the surface like a discarded doll. "He wasn't the one I came for, just a snack." "Keep testing me," he warned, his voice low and full of fire, "and I'll erase you." "Or should I say," she whispered, eyes gleaming, "I'll erase what's left of the shaman bloodline." "Is that your noble steed?" She eyed the diminutive draft horse struggling to pull a creaky, sagging cart. "You've got no jurisdiction here," she said, her voice cold and flat. The man towering over her opened his mouth to reply, but a violent blast of wind tore through the air, muffling whatever words he tried to form. The gale howled with such ferocity that he had to brace himself to stay upright. He stood there, powerless, as the witch rose into the sky and was swallowed by the churning storm. Once she was gone, he sprinted to the water's edge. A body bobbed in the current, drifting just close enough for him to lunge and grab hold. He dragged it onto the bank, dropped to his knees, and began chest compressions with urgent rhythm. He screamed into the storm, hoping someone, anyone, was nearby. No answer. Fumbling with wet fingers, he pulled out his iPhone and punched in 911. Even as he continued administering CPR, he could hear sirens in the distance. The medics arrived quickly, squad cars not far behind. Panting, he described how he'd seen the body and pulled it from the water. From that moment on, the professionals took charge. Speaking with officers, He told them he'd just gone for a leisurely drive, parking near a riverside house to enjoy the marina view. That's when he spotted the motionless figure and acted on instinct. The first responders worked quickly, confusion on their faces. The wounds made no sense. Aside from the telltale signs of nearly drowning, the body bore deep, intricate lacerations, surgical in their precision and oddly unnatural. They recorded his statement and informed him someone might be in touch later. The prognosis wasn't good. The victim had likely suffered severe oxygen deprivation. Even if he survived, there was little hope of avoiding lasting brain damage. John Lake took a shaky breath, the weight of it all pressing down on him. This was too bizarre, too unreal. His great-grandfather had been a venerated shaman. His grandfather a notorious drunk. And his father? Gone without a trace shortly after John entered the world. He'd picked up fragments of the old ways, but mysticism wasn't his field. He was a practical man. An engineer by trade, responsible for quality control at the Ford plant in Hamtramck. And this? None of this made sense in his world. Peeling off his leather jacket, he walked toward his car. A Mustang GT, the same kind she used to call a pony car. Its 450-plus horsepower engine was raw, modern power, a mechanical totem, his version of a spirit animal. His ancestors might have worn feathers and fur, but they'd never outrun what this machine could do. Meanwhile, over at Mallory Dock, Renee's nerves were beginning to fray. Jack had told her to wait, but more than 3 hours had passed, and now doubt was creeping in. Caleb was probably home already, maybe even realizing she wasn't there. Fortunately, she'd only packed just enough to stay under the radar. If she was lucky, he'd assume she'd stormed out to crash with a friend and would expect a call when she cooled off. It was a good cover story, except she'd already ditched the phone he gave her. That thing was traceable. Instead, she'd bought a prepaid burner but had zero plans to use it to contact him. The last thing she needed was to hand Caleb a trail to follow. With the kind of money he had, finding her would be child's play if she slipped up. She wrapped her arms around herself and shuddered. The waterfront was frigid, the chill sinking into her bones. What if Jack had bailed? Still, she didn't believe it. Men usually bent over backward for her. But lately, things felt different. Was the charm wearing thin? Was time slowly stealing her edge? A cruel little voice whispered from somewhere deep inside. You should have stayed with Caleb. That man adored you. You could have had the whole package, love, safety, everything. She dismissed the thought as a spark of flame flared on the deck of a nearby vessel. "Hey there, sailor," she called when she caught sight of the man lighting a smoke. He looked over, same guy who'd talked to Jack earlier about her. Taking a long drag, he gave a friendly wave and came down the gangplank toward her. He winced at the cold as he reached the dock. "Hell of a night for this," he started to say, then stopped himself. "What are you doing standing out here like that?" Renee flashed a soft, disarming smile, and he felt warmth rush through him despite the freezing air. "Oh, waiting on Jack again, huh?" he said, putting it together. He added, "You'd be better off staying in his cabin. Nobody'll mess with you there." "That's so kind of you," she said, her voice like velvet. "I'll be sure to let Jack know how thoughtful you were. Who knows, maybe we'll find a way to repay you." Carl lit up with a grin. If her hint meant what he hoped it meant, he was already imagining the payoff. He found it strange how many bags she'd decided to bring. It puzzled him why she hadn't simply left them in the car. Once he walked her back to Jack's room, he returned to join his co-workers for a game of cards. Next chapter. Caleb Drayton was driving far too fast, bordering on recklessness. The past few hours had left him shaken and unsteady. He wasn't thinking clearly. Emotion had taken the wheel. His earlier appointment with the private investigator had gone as badly as he'd feared. And somehow, things had spiraled further from there. Caleb had visited the PI's office to retrieve a dossier he'd been dreading. Inside were photographs and videos, undeniable proof of Renee's betrayal. The detective had warned him not to look. Instead, he urged Caleb to present the contents to Renee directly, to let her know he knew the truth, and use that knowledge to persuade her to end the affair. The seasoned investigator had spoken with a gravelly, world-weary voice. "Take it from me, son," he'd said, heavy with years of grim experience. "I've seen couples make it through worse. Not just survive, some even come out stronger. He believed reconciliation was still possible, but only if Caleb was willing to put in the work. Caleb hadn't bothered to argue. Despite everything, he was still willing to forgive Renee, but only once. That was why he needed the evidence. He planned to confront her the moment he got home, to make his case, lay out his expectations, and give her a clear decision. She was fully aware of the prenuptial terms. If they separated before their 7th anniversary, she'd walk away with nearly nothing. And they were just 2 years into the marriage. Despite all of it, Caleb still wanted a life with her more than one without. He felt like he had no real alternative. His love for Renee ran so deep, the thought of losing her was unbearable. If that made him weak, then so be it. As he drove, his mind raced with questions. Was there a reason behind her cheating? Could she be addicted to gambling? Renee had no real grasp of their finances. God, he hoped that was it. Gambling he could fix. He could pay her debts, get her help, and maybe rebuild what they had. "Renee?" he called as he stepped through the door. He placed the folder gently on the kitchen table. During the drive, he'd gone over what he was going to say. He'd ask her to look at the photos, maybe even the videos. He would tell her he had already seen them and couldn't bring himself to view them again. He feared that if he did, he might lose control and kick her out on the spot. This, he believed, was a more measured approach. But there was a hitch. Renee wasn't there. He called out to her several more times and checked each room, but found nothing. Eventually, he sat down at the kitchen table with the folder right in front of him, rehearsing his angry expression. 30 minutes passed. He glanced at the clock. It was approaching midnight. Renee had never stayed out this late without letting him know. He tried calling, but her phone went straight to voicemail. In all the time they'd been married, she'd never gone this long without checking in, unless they were together. Something was off. He felt it deep in his gut. He started calling her friends one by one. None of them had seen or spoken to her. Caleb was completely in the dark. Eventually, he flipped on the television in a half-hearted attempt to distract himself, but ended up dozing off on the couch. A few hours later, he woke, disoriented, and dragged himself to the bedroom. Still no sign of her. It was nearly 3 in the morning. Then he noticed something strange. The painting that usually covered the wall safe was hanging crooked. He walked over and discovered the safe was slightly ajar. Worse, it had been emptied. His first instinct was that someone had broken in, or worse, that Renee had been taken. In a panic, he rushed to his office and opened the surveillance software on his computer. Their system was motion-activated and kept footage for the past 2 weeks. They used it for home security and to keep tabs on contractors and other service workers. He skimmed through the files, trying to pinpoint the last time there'd been movement in the house. And then there it was, footage of Renee leaving, alone, hurried. A few minutes later, she appeared again, retrieving items from the safe, packing multiple bags with clothes and valuables. Caleb's eyes filled with tears. They slid down his cheeks without a sound. Why had she done it? Didn't she understand how much he loved her? If what she wanted was the money, the items she took, he would have given them to her freely. She didn't need to disappear. Maybe she thought it was the only way. Maybe she had a hunch that he'd figured out the truth. Perhaps she thought he was preparing to walk away, leave her empty-handed. And in a strange way, that seemed fair. Caleb knew he had to find her. The question was, how? Then he remembered, the tracking device in her vehicle. Looking back, it all seemed ridiculous. That little chip had sparked one of their worst blowouts. She had her heart set on a Lexus, just like the ones her friends paraded around. Caleb refused. Instead, he bought her a Cadillac XRS convertible. He was firm about buying American. Renee had pitched a fit. She outright refused to even touch the thing. For nearly a month, that sleek red convertible sat unused in their driveway. Everything changed the day a friend's Lexus broke down before a salon appointment. With no other option, they reluctantly took the Cadillac. After that, Renee was hooked. Her friends were green with envy. Within a few months, nearly all of them had Cadillacs too. Caleb called the company behind the GPS chip. He explained that his wife had gone out shopping and had somehow lost track of the car. Renee had locked herself out and forgotten where she'd parked so many times that the story didn't raise suspicion. She often contacted the service to unlock the car remotely. Without a second thought, the representative gave him the car's location. Caleb jumped into his Mustang and floored it toward the riverfront. Sure enough, when he arrived, there it was, her signature red convertible. He approached quickly, but something felt off right away. The doors were flung open. The keys were lying on the seat. Next to them sat a single envelope. He tore it open and read, "Caleb, don't waste your grief on me. Don't cling to the idea that I might come back. I won't pretend to be sorry. I won't offer you comforting lies. That would just give you false hope. And believe me, that's far crueler. This has nothing to do with you finding out about the affair. Don't twist yourself into knots wondering where you went wrong. There was no moment you lost me, because you never truly had me. From the beginning, we were a lie. I never loved you, not for a second. You were a shield, a place to hide. I was running from the law, from enemies, from consequences. I figured I'd stay 6 months, maybe a year. But then you were so soft, so easy to fool. I stuck around. You made it simple to drain your finances. I had plans to take even more. But you caught on before I could finish. As for the cheating, don't dwell on it. We were never compatible in bed. You're too gentle, too romantic. That's not what excites me. Some women want it rough. You're not built for that world. One day you'll meet some sweet, simple girl and build your little dream life. But that's not me. It never was. If I feel anything close to guilt, it's just over how this might break your gullible heart. But you needed the pain. You're too trusting, too soft, too clueless for how harsh the world really is. Someone had to be the one to teach you. My only regret, not emptying your accounts before I left. Renee, P.S. That's not even my real name. No, I won't miss you. But I will miss this car. Caleb dropped to the ground beside the Cadillac. Tears streamed down his face unchecked. Time lost all meaning. Was it 10 minutes, an hour, more? He didn't know, didn't care. Then something changed. The air itself seemed to shift. The wind started to scream. At first, Caleb didn't react. What was left to care about? Everything, his life, his future, had crumbled in seconds. And the worst part? Even now he was willing to forgive her. Even after that letter. Suddenly the streetlights began to flicker. The wind howled louder, fierce enough to bend metal signs and lift trash off the street. In the eye of that storm, Caleb looked up and saw a woman watching him. She spoke, but her voice was swallowed by the roar. Sensing his confusion, she shook her head, and the chaos stopped. Silence fell, eerie and complete. This isn't real, Caleb thought. It has to be a coincidence. You're a man? The woman asked sharply. Caleb gave a slow nod. Barely, he whispered. She narrowed her eyes. That doesn't make sense. I've never been called for a man before. I'm usually summoned when a woman gets destroyed by some cheating creep. Sometimes I show up just to torment some guy who's been a total jerk. She paused, clearly perplexed. But this, she said, shaking her head, this is something entirely new. Only a woman could ache like that. Men rarely suffer so deeply, unless it's the death of a dog, a championship loss, or a fresh scratch on their beloved car. Sometimes, sure, a father will mourn his children, but not often. She watched him with a calm, curious gaze. Tell me something, she said softly. I want to know your story. Caleb froze, speechless. The woman lifted her hand, and the wind exploded around him in a frenzy. The storm singled him out, wrapping him in a cyclone, lifting him skyward, and flinging him across the river like a leaf. He plunged into the glacial water without even a breath to spare. As the cold pulled him under, Caleb realized he felt nothing. Life had ended when Renee did. Beneath the surface, hands closed around him. He didn't resist. They belonged to Noah Brina, her palms icy against his scalp. She was here for his memories. Piece by piece, she stripped Renee from his mind. Every image, every emotion, gone. When he woke up, her name would mean nothing. How brutal. On the bank, she sensed eyes on her. A squad car rolled past. It clipped a fallen road sign and swerved down to the shore. The officer inside jumped out and saw Caleb flailing in the current. Without hesitation, she charged into the river, grabbed him, and pulled him to safety. Noah Brina allowed herself a subtle grin. He'd live now, but her work wasn't done. Just as she began her search anew, the current yanked her deeper. This pull was different, stronger. She broke the surface again and immediately felt the presence. The same nuisance from before. John Lake. Clad in black leather, he held the ancient Ojibwa war club again. This time, he didn't speak just one of her names, he called two. The impact was stronger. He hadn't mastered her yet, but he was getting closer. What he didn't yet understand, she was no longer only wind. Now she carried a human soul too, fused to her by agony, betrayal, and loss. That fusion had changed everything. Now it was November's mess to clean up. The last spiritualist, just a girl really, had tried to save someone, but she'd only managed to preserve a fragment. She hadn't slapped Jack just to be mean. He'd insulted her. And now this amateur mystic was tampering with Neubrina's domain. If he ever learned a third name, he might not destroy her. But he could seal her away, banish her until next year's turning. Even she didn't know what that would do to her. But if he tried, the consequences were his to bear. The Witch of November, John Lake declared, hoisting the club in both hands. In my ancestors' tongue, Gashkodino Hysis, I bind you. Your domain shall be the Great Lakes, Erie, Ontario, Michigan, Huron, and Superior. From this moment on, these waters shall hold you. Forever. He struck the earth with the weapon. A pulse of force radiated from it, rippling outward like a shockwave. Neubrina winced. It was only a faint sting, but it infuriated her. With a snap of her wrist, she sent John flying. Hit the wall, she muttered. A gale roared to life and hurled him backward at breakneck speed. Just before he struck the concrete, she spun him mid-air to spare his head. He lived. Barely. 7 broken ribs. Both legs shattered. His left arm in pieces. As he lay unconscious, she floated to the ground beside him. She wasn't sure why she'd spared his life. Something about him. With a subtle gesture, a breeze stirred him awake. He blinked up at her in fear. I let you keep your right hand, she said, a smirk dancing on her lips. Use it to write me a thank you. If you're trying to scare me, he groaned, you should know I'm left-handed. Then sue me, she shot back, already turning toward the river. Her mind had already moved on. There was someone else she had to find. Next chapter. Should she remain or walk away? Janet Charles stared at the man resting in the hospital bed. She sat quietly by his side, scanning his face for signs of wakefulness. He was handsome but clearly lost. Just 2 hours earlier, she'd hauled him from the river's icy grip. He had been cold, dazed, unable to explain how he'd ended up there. He mumbled about driving, searching for something important. But whatever it was had vanished completely from his thoughts. She filed the report, and the detective on duty promised to keep her updated. Detective Bernie Gorka might have been new to the department, but he wasn't green when it came to investigative work. He had a steady hand and a dependable nature, and he had no problem sharing everything he'd uncovered about the man Janet had rescued from the river. Janet listened carefully, offering little in response. Officially, she wasn't attached to the case, but nobody, least of all the captain, objected to her hanging around the hospital. There was something about the whole situation that hovered between the bizarre and the heartbreaking. And the more she looked into the mystery man's past, the more she couldn't bring herself to let it go. Even while he slept, she found herself watching him, trying to piece together who he really was. Most of her questions had been answered thanks to Gorka's thorough legwork, but a few still lingered, nagging at her. His name was Caleb Drayton. Records showed he was married, at least that had been the case at one point. As per protocol, both he and his spouse were vetted. But what came back raised more questions than answers. Caleb didn't stand out on paper. He worked in software, successful, competent, and comfortably wealthy. Not a tech mogul, but definitely someone who wouldn't blink at dropping 6 figures. His background check was spotless, aside from a few minor traffic infractions, which he'd taken care of quickly and politely. Janet had seen his car by the river. It was exactly the kind of flashy vehicle that practically dared the traffic cops to write it up. Honestly, it wouldn't have shocked her if the car manual came with a warning about accumulating citations. But things got interesting when they started digging into the woman listed as his wife. The first oddity, they had tied the knot in Vegas. Nothing illegal about that, but it felt a little out of step for someone like him. Then came the real twist. No official records for a Renee car existed. The only documented person by that name had passed away in 1980. Whoever this woman was, she'd been living under a stolen identity. Their shared finances added more fuel to the fire. All joint accounts had been emptied just the day before. It was only thanks to the bank's biometric vault access that they caught the break they needed. The fingerprints didn't match Renee Carr. Instead, they traced back to someone else entirely, Margaret Ann McGillicuddy. Janet recognized the name immediately. McGillicuddy had been on the run for over a decade, wanted in connection with a major insurance scam out of Chicago. Everyone else involved had been caught and served time, but Margaret had simply vanished. Now, the truth was out. She'd reinvented herself as the loving wife of a respectable man. A deep dive into Caleb's phone revealed he had been tracking her, searching her car's GPS history, trying to find out where she'd disappeared to. When they examined her car, the forensics team pulled a clean set of prints that conclusively linked Renee Drayton to Margaret Ann McGillicuddy. And then there was the letter. Janet read the note the woman had left behind, and it hit hard. It wasn't just callous, it was venomous. Even the most stoic officers who read it were visibly shaken. Some avoided even making eye contact with Caleb afterward. Their discomfort wasn't just empathy, it was self-reflection. They saw in him a reflection of what could happen to any of them. Betrayal, collapse, isolation. Being a cop didn't exactly lend itself to healthy relationships. Divorces, infidelity, messy separations, those were practically part of the job description. Janet carried her own scars. Her last boyfriend had been threatened by her profession, and their relationship had turned toxic. Arguments had escalated until one night, she'd been forced to draw her service weapon just to keep him from hurting her. That had been almost a year ago. He never came back to collect his stuff. After 6 months, she packed it all up and gave it away. She hadn't dated since. It wasn't a conscious decision, just inertia. Sometimes she'd stare into the mirror, trying to pinpoint where things had gone so wrong. She was 32, attractive, accomplished, and utterly alone. Most of her friends were married by now, some even on to second marriages, with kids in tow. She didn't need a heartthrob. She just wanted someone genuine. Someone who would love her back, stay loyal, stick around. She was drifting in that thought when the man beside her stirred. A quiet voice broke the silence. "Where am I?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper. The sound pulled her instantly back to the present. "You're in the hospital, Mr. Drayton," she said softly. "Do you have any idea how you ended up here?" "I do," he said. "I was in the river. A beautiful cop dragged me out." Janet's face turned a deep shade of red. "That was you, wasn't it?" he asked, watching her closely. She gave a brief nod, attempting to keep her composure. "Can you remember anything else?" he continued. "Like why you were in the water in the first place? What brought you to that area?" "There was a crazy wind," he said, "like dangerously strong. I think I slipped and went under, but why I was there to begin with, that's still fuzzy." He hesitated, then added, "I think I was looking for someone. Or something, but I can't pin down who or what it was." "We think you were trying to track down your wife," Janet told him carefully. "The investigation turned up a letter. According to what we've pieced together, she walked out on you and took a large amount of your money." She hesitated before continuing. "Forgive me if I'm stepping out of line, but she really did a number on you. You didn't deserve any of it." Caleb Drayton looked her in the eyes. "Officer, I've never been married," he said plainly. "You might be thinking of someone else. It's possible the cases are starting to blur together for you." Later that day, a team of medical specialists ran a battery of tests on Drayton. They diagnosed him with mild hypothermia, most likely from prolonged exposure to frigid water. Other than that, his physical and mental evaluations came back normal. But his memory, the part involving his supposed wife, was blank. The truth was, the whole marriage had been a lie from the start. It was a sham ceremony that could be nullified with a simple court filing. The woman had forged details on the marriage certificate and wed him under false claims. When Janet presented the official documentation, he could barely connect with it. She began stopping by more frequently after that. Caleb had no close relatives nearby, and Janet found herself genuinely enjoying his company. She even started helping him handle communication with his lawyers. Psychologists involved in the case recommended that Janet be the one to explain his legal options, considering her rapport with him. Caleb thought about asking for a private hospital room, but didn't see the point. The patient in the next bed was unresponsive, kept in a medically induced coma. That man had been found around the same time and near the same location as Caleb. He was a towering native man, severely injured with multiple fractures. Doctors planned to try bringing him out of sedation the next day, unless he woke up on his own first. Next chapter. Dirk! I figured you weren't part of what went down, the voice said. You were here knocked out when it all happened. They never mentioned your name, so I didn't either. We have to get you out of here, he said. I can't, she replied. Renee gently placed her hand on Carl's. They're not hunting me because of Jack, she said softly. It's other people. Guys my husband hired. Jack had a plan to get me to Wisconsin. He was going to help me start over, disappear. My husband's rich, and he's got reach everywhere. If they find me and haul me back, it'll be hell. The last time I tried to run, he kept me locked up for almost a month straight. I'm begging you, help me vanish. Carl studied her intently as she spoke. He was older than Jack, more seasoned and far harder to fool. As he listened, something didn't sit right. Renee wasn't telling the truth. He could see it in every word she spoke. She was putting on a show. Next chapter. John Lake came to in the hospital, slowly waking to a body covered in splints and gauze. Every breath came with sharp, grinding pain, like he'd been crushed under steel. Even so, he knew he was lucky to be alive. Only a day ago, he had spoken to his great-grandfather. The old man had passed down a sacred weapon, a war club said to hold immense spiritual power. John had tried to summon the autumn storm spirit, using both her ancient Ojibwa name and the title sailors on the Great Lakes had given her. By all accounts, the ritual should have worked, but it didn't. Time drifted past, and Halloween arrived. Tonight, the boundary between this world and the next would be at its thinnest. Spirits, especially one as ancient and formidable as the storm elemental, would reach the peak of their strength. And he'd already failed to stop her. Everything told him that the man she killed during their first encounter wasn't her endgame. It was just the opening act. She was preparing to strike again, and John had no way to prevent it. Only now did he admit to himself that he had never truly been a shaman. Sure, he sped around town in his Mustang, draped in black leather like some urban legend. But when it mattered most, when the pressure rose, November shattered him, splintered his spirit and scattered the shards. She broke him the same way Gitchagumi used to wreck ships, just like that haunting old song about the doomed freighter. That faithful, dependable vessel had turned to wreckage the moment November's wrath arrived ahead of schedule. Its fate had hinged entirely on blind luck, and maybe a shift in the wind's temper. It was on the Detroit River where he first met her, a witch. She radiated power, undeniable, formidable, but her strength was muted there, inland. Out on Lake Superior, though, she would have been invincible. He remembered the lyrics from that song, verses passed down in his family for generations. The ancient tales of Gitchagumi still whispered through Chippewa lands and beyond. They said the big lake never gave back its dead, not when November showed up early, riding storms. That old tune lined up with the legends almost exactly. If November hunted you down on that water and caught you, you were never going home. And it wasn't just a handful of sailors who'd vanished. The lake had claimed many. John realized, his breath catching, that he was only alive because the witch had decided to let him go. It had been her whim, nothing more. Their first meeting had ended with a cryptic smile and a warning. She might have finished him this time. In fact, she half-joked about taking an arm and leaving him the rest. Now all he could do was murmur prayers for the dead, because what else was left? Still, something gnawed at him. People always referred to the early autumn gales as the November witch. But when had she taken on flesh? Why would such a force even need a body? His thoughts scattered at the click of high heels against linoleum. A woman strode briskly past his hospital bed and halted next to the man in the one beside it. She was striking, radiant, and the man she stood over was clearly someone important to her. John had known love before, but never this kind. Never a love that burned so clearly for someone else. He tried to drift back to sleep, but their voices crept in, low and clear. He shouldn't have listened, but with no TV, no music, what else could he do? They spoke about a woman who had devastated a man, left him utterly ruined. He had been madly in love, the story went, and she had dismantled his world. Now he claimed not to remember her at all. Even when shown a photograph, his eyes were blank, no flicker of recognition. Not even hypnosis could drag her name or face from the recesses of his mind. But under hypnosis, he described someone else entirely. A thin woman with wild hair floating like smoke, who carried him off into the river on a gust of wind. After the psychologist left, a woman, clearly law enforcement despite being off duty, tucked the man under a blanket. She sighed and murmured, "If only—" Then her gaze lifted and met John's, too late to hide that he'd been watching. She was caught, startled, but John only offered calm reassurance. "It's okay," he said. "I've seen things too. I won't say a word." She nodded, grateful, and quietly exited the room. He noticed she returned later, even though she wasn't on the job. Next chapter. Renee lay stretched out on Jack's filthy mattress, her head sinking into the fabric worn thin by years. At the rate this rust bucket was crawling through the water, she figured she'd die of old age before they made it to Wisconsin. It was Halloween night, and the crew was celebrating. For the officers, that meant stiff drinks and ghost stories, tales of eerie encounters on the Great Lakes. It wasn't until much later that Renee learned the gut-wrenching truth. Carl had been selling her to the crew, and he was doing well off it. $50 a visit, and he'd already made over $1,000. By the time they hit port, he'd be sitting pretty with a full wallet. "You know what kind of STDs I could be picking up from this?" he complained one night. "Not worth it. Total hassle." That same toxic thought returned, curling up inside her again, the one that had been riding her since she ran. "I should have stayed with Caleb. At least he loved me. We might have had a shot." But like always, she pushed it down. Her life was just a chain of wrong turns, and it was too late now to rewrite any of them. Next chapter. At exactly midnight, November rose from the depths of Lake Superior. She reached, not with fingers, but with the breath of wind that licked the hulls of every ship on the water. The one she sought was close. She could feel the pulse of the massive freighter slicing forward at nearly 15 knots. It was just past Black Bay on the U.S. side, still within the protective arms of the coast, but not for long. She could already taste the bitterness of her target's guilt and agony. It hung on him like smoke. The more she lingered on that feeling, the stronger the wind blew, colder too. And with the cold came rising waves. November watched quietly, her expression serene. As the wind grazed the hull of the massive freighter, she could feel movement awakening within its iron bones. Whether the ship would outlast the coming hours, or if its sailors would live to greet the sunrise, was no longer something she would intervene in. Their fate this time belonged to them alone. Aboard the Mallory, the communications officer had just contacted the National Weather Service. His name was Paul Pittman, and tension was coiling in his chest. The waves were climbing, not dramatically, but enough to make him uneasy. The storm was harsher, louder, and more unpredictable than he had anticipated. Despite predictions of gentle weather and warmer skies, something about it all felt off. Pittman reached out to a friend stationed higher up on the ship. Lake Superior was so expansive it could host a tempest in one region while another remained deceptively calm. But the conversation only heightened Pittman's anxiety. His friend's report matched what the forecast had promised: calm seas and mild skies. Still, Pittman couldn't raise the alarm, not without risking ridicule. If he spoke out without proof, the officers would laugh him off, and his credibility would be shot. An hour passed before Pittman reluctantly called up to the bridge. By then, he no longer had to worry about sounding paranoid. The wind had surged, roaring hard enough to halve the ship's effective speed, even with the engines running full tilt. To make matters worse, the waves had nearly doubled since they left sheltered waters. The Mallory was still afloat, but only just, and Pittman understood too well how ruthless the lake could be. A soft noise at the bridge entrance pulled his gaze. A senior deckhand had stepped in, requesting a moment. It was Ian Talbot, a seasoned hand with over 10 years aboard the Mallory. His face was pale, drained of color. "We'll come through this, Ike," said Captain Gordon Song, steady and composed. A veteran of nearly 4 decades on the Great Lakes, Song wore confidence like armor. "I've been through storms just like this one, and so has this ship. I know you're uneasy, but this is just a rough patch. Head back to your quarters, pour a drink, it'll be over soon." Ike gave a quiet salute and turned to leave. He knew the captain was lying, but not to deceive. Song wasn't trying to mislead his crew, he was shielding them. Because if the captain faltered, the entire crew would unravel. This wasn't deceit, it was command. A necessary illusion, like soothing words before a painful procedure. Sometimes the truth cuts too deep, and people run from it. Or worse, they freeze, paralyzed by fear. So Song kept up the act. Because fear spreads quickly. And on a vessel like this, that kind of fear could kill. Still, Ian had been through his share of storms, and nothing had ever felt like this. The ship should have been slicing through the water like a sharpened knife. Instead, it bounced and rolled like a child's toy in a wash basin. Every shudder, every drop was sharper than the last. Men who usually worked the deck without complaint now huddled in silence, faces pale, hiding in their bunks. No one had to say it aloud. Every soul aboard understood. The Witch of November had come to collect. As Ian stepped away from the bridge, a fierce gust slammed him into the bulkhead. He grabbed the cold steel for balance, but the next surge of wind lifted him off the deck entirely. For a surreal heartbeat, he hovered, weightless. Then the wind laid him gently down again. Stunned, he looked around. That wasn't normal. That wasn't natural. Jack would have laughed himself breathless at the story, assuming he believed it at all. But Jack rarely believed in anything. That had always been the damn thing with Jack. A voice called from behind. Ian turned. By the railing, that railing, the one where he and Jack had once stood watching kids wave from Detroit's shores, stood a figure. A woman, slim and composed, framed by the storm's chaos. "Come talk to me, Ian," she said, her tone soft and inviting. The fury of the storm didn't seem to touch her. Her hair streamed wildly, arms open as if welcoming the wind. Her smile showed no hint of fear. Just then, the Mallory pitched violently, rising over a monstrous wave. Rain, or maybe it was seawater flung by the wind, slashed sideways across the deck. The cold tore into Ian's skin like a blade, but the woman stood there nearly unclothed, unmoving. She should have been shivering. She should have been afraid. Yet she wasn't. Ian, rooted by dread on the ship he knew best, watched her, unafraid, untouched. And then he understood. Recognition gripped his chest like frost, followed by something deeper, a quiet reverence. His fear didn't vanish, it changed. He walked toward her, step by slow step, and stopped beside the railing. "You're a GR, aren't you?" he asked. "I'm afraid that's true," Neubrina said, her smile faint but filled with unsettling certainty. You can't be—" Ike stuttered, words catching in his throat. "Oh, but I can," she replied, the corners of her mouth curling up. "I decided to arrive a little earlier this season." "You realize what that means, don't you?" he asked, dread tightening his voice. Without hesitating, she added calmly, "That doesn't necessarily mean it's something to fear." Ike exhaled heavily and turned to glance at the woman standing beside him. A silent voice inside him warned that whatever he was about to say, it would be unwelcome. "Even if you tried throwing me overboard, Ian," she said, her voice as smooth as glass, "it wouldn't change anything. I don't die, not in any way your kind understands, because death isn't something I ever truly belong to. And I'd be furious when I got back up. I honestly expected better judgment from you." "What am I supposed to do?" Ike asked, his tone strained with urgency. "Bring your captain here," she said, a sly gleam in her eye. He crossed the deck slowly at first, dread weighing down every step, before breaking into a sprint toward the bridge. This time, he didn't hesitate. He stormed through the door like a man fleeing the edge of death, his face ghost-pale and eyes wild. Everyone in the bridge turned to stare. "What in hell are you doing, Ike?" Pittman snapped. "You know better than to barge in like this." "Ike, explain yourself," said Captain Song, his voice clipped and commanding. Ike's lips trembled as he spoke. "Captain, it's a witch," Song scowled. "Ike, We've all been through enough storms to know why they're called what they're called. Get a grip or I'll have you locked up. No, Captain! Ike shouted, his panic now fully unleashed. It's not a figure of speech, it's her. She's real, and she wants to talk to you. She's waiting outside, right on the deck of this cursed ship, and if you don't listen to her, we won't live to see the dawn. Song narrowed his eyes. Have you lost your mind? The November Witch is a sailor's legend, a nickname for these violent winds. Then tell me how there's a woman out there, standing against this storm like she's sunbathing in a Florida breeze, Ike yelled, breathless. If you think I'm imagining things, go take a look yourself. Throw me in the brig, kick me off the crew, I don't care, but please just talk to her. Realizing his outburst might have crossed the line, Ike stiffened, saluted, and added, Sir. Without a single word, Captain Song turned to a locked cabinet at the back of the bridge. He opened it and handed out rifles one by one to the officers in the room. One of them, Tom Dooley, built like a mountain, refused the weapon. We're dealing with a woman, right? He asked. Ike gave a small nod. Then I don't need a rifle, Dooley said with a grin. If she gives us trouble, I'll just toss her over the side. With that, the captain, 6 riflemen, and Dooley bringing up the rear, exited the bridge and stepped into the storm. Ike, heart-pounding, backed away from the scene. There she stood, at the railing, exactly where Ike had seen her, and didn't so much as blink when the captain approached. What business do you have on my ship? Captain Song demanded. She turned to him slowly, amused by his authority. And what's your vessel doing in my sister's waters? She replied, voice sharp and mocking. Who are you? He barked. Is this some sort of joke? You know perfectly well who I am, Captain Song, she said flatly. Don't pretend otherwise, it doesn't suit you. With a slight smirk, she added, Your ship might end up a little damp. Dooley, take her to the brig until we sort this out, the captain ordered. Dooley stepped forward, fists clenched, his heavy boots thudding on the deck. But before he could lay a hand on her, she raised one finger, just one, and lifted an eyebrow. A furious gust exploded from nowhere, catching the massive man like a rag doll and hurling him into the sky. He screamed, spinning through the air as the rest of the crew watched, frozen in disbelief. You don't need men like him aboard your vessel, Captain, the woman, November, said without emotion. With the faintest movement of her hand, Dooley was flung from the ship entirely, vanishing into the frigid sea with a splash so distant it barely registered. No scream followed his fall, just silence. The remaining crew, still reeling, instinctively raised their weapons and opened fire. 7 rifles roared in unison, bullets slicing through wind and rain. They stood tense, breath held, waiting for her to drop. But she didn't fall, she didn't even flinch. Her eyes locked onto Captain Song. I offered you the easy way, she said, voice smooth and cold. But you chose resistance. You brought your ship into my sister's realm, and we welcomed you as visitors. But that welcome has come to an end. By the time this night is over, Captain, I will have what I came for. Whether you accept it or not. Now we do this my way. The woman extended her hands, and with a sudden rush of air, she lifted gracefully into the sky. In that instant, the captain grasped the truth. She was the force behind the tempest. The realization hit him like thunder. The violent waves and creeping cold weren't natural. They were her doing. But even as clarity struck, the storm grew fiercer. The lake, once calm, now writhed as monstrous swells rose like watery giants, crashing in a chaotic rhythm. Gazing at the airborne figure, the captain felt a dreadful certainty settle in his bones. His ship couldn't endure another onslaught like that. One particularly massive wave loomed ahead, towering nearly 50 feet high, its shadow stretching across the vessel. It would obliterate the ship and take every soul aboard with it. What do you want from us? The captain asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Instantly, the colossal wave froze in place, then began to recede. The surface of the water smoothed into a peaceful shimmer, disturbed only by a faint chill in the breeze. I can see the whore, the woman November said evenly. What whore? The captain replied, confused. There are no women on my ship. Then he added quickly, no offense meant. None taken, she answered with composure. Summon your entire crew to the deck. Captain Song gave a curt nod to his officers, who dispersed at once, alerting the sailors below. There was no need for explanation. The men already had their suspicions, rumors whispered since Ike first spoke of strange company on board. As they gathered, the murmurs spread like wildfire. Some men covered their mouths at the word witch. Old fears rekindled. Several seasoned sailors kept their backs to the walls, deliberately distancing themselves from November as though proximity alone might condemn them. "Gentlemen," she addressed the crew, her voice calm but firm, "please bear with me. This isn't something I do often. I don't usually speak to humans. Most times I just drag your ships beneath the water and let the lake take you. But tonight is different. No one needs to die. I've only come for one person. So let me make it plain. Either she comes with me, or all of you go down together." "There's no woman here," the captain insisted, his tone hardening. "You have 10 minutes, November replied icily. "Choose wisely." The sailors huddled together, their voices rising in frantic argument. "I'm not dying and leaving my kids behind because of some floozy," one man shouted. "Who?" the captain demanded. "The one fooling around with the crew ever since we left Michigan," another answered. "Carl's been charging us to sleep with her," a third added bitterly. "We can't just offer up someone to a monster," the captain said, visibly shaken. "That would be evil." "She's no innocent," a sailor snapped. "Good women don't act like that. And she's a witch. She don't even follow God." "I'm done waiting," November shrieked. The wind roared again, and the lake responded, its surface churning violently with her fury. Just as the captain began to protest, 3 sailors bolted below deck and returned moments later, dragging Renee with them. "No!" the captain bellowed. "You can't do this! I won't allow it!" "Miss Witch?" one crewman asked with forced courtesy. "Do you want the captain too?" November paused, considering. The captain steadied himself and asked if she'd accept the woman if she were placed into a lifeboat. November's gaze locked on Renee, her eyes cold and unreadable. "I'll take her as she is," she said at last. Before Renee could speak, a gust of wind hurled her into the air. November followed, rising effortlessly behind her. "From this night until season's end," she declared, her voice booming with the storm, "no harm shall come to your ship upon these waters. And should any of your crew fall overboard, even during the fiercest gale, they will be delivered safely back to land." With that, she vanished into the sky, leaving behind only stunned silence. Renee plummeted into the icy lake, landing beside another woman. She tried to swim, but the cold paralyzed her limbs instantly. With her last breath held tight, she slipped beneath the surface. Then hands grasped her. She opened her eyes underwater and saw the other woman beside her. There would be no manipulating this one. Renee sensed it. No charm or trick would work here. The woman gripped her head roughly, and then the memories came flooding back. She saw every scheme, every deceit, every possession she'd stolen through manipulation. The lies, the betrayals, the smugness, it all surged through her like poison. The worst of it was recent. When her mind reached the memory of Caleb, she felt his love as a tangible, radiant thing, and saw, with gut-wrenching clarity, how thoughtlessly she had discarded something so rare and sincere. In that moment, she understood the depth of her own depravity, and that perhaps the world would be better off without her. Then, unexpectedly, another presence entered her thoughts. She opened her eyes and saw the other woman speaking. 36 years ago, I was no different from you. That's why I became what I am now, to purge others like us from the world." Renee lowered her head slowly, solemnly, in silent understanding. Regret had crushed her, a suffocating sorrow for all the time she'd thrown away. Then it ended. Icy lake water rushed into her lungs. Next chapter. Aboard the Mallory, Paul Pittman responded to a radio call. Turning toward the onboard computer, he quickly sent out a set of images via email. He had been preparing for this. Just after the women disembarked, the captain had insisted they remain silent about what had happened. He reminded them the dock was always under surveillance. He knew it wouldn't be long before someone realized the missing woman had been on his ship. The crew had captured various photos and videos of her while she was aboard. Those were the files Paul shared with both the Coast Guard and Detroit PD. In his report, he explained that she'd been found on the Mallory shortly after departure. Apparently, she'd gone overboard after drinking too much during a Halloween celebration with the crew. The photos made it clear she had joined in willingly. But tragically, while still intoxicated, she had fallen into the lake. At that point, she was simply considered missing. The Coast Guard had been notified, and a search vessel was already on its way to recover her, if possible. It was deemed an unfortunate accident, nothing more. Because the captain hadn't known she was on board at the time, he received only a formal warning and was advised to be more vigilant in the future. Meanwhile, it was also discovered that another person, Tom Dooley, had vanished during the storm. His body was never found. The whole affair was strange enough to prompt the Coast Guard to carry out multiple thorough inspections of the ship. For over 2 weeks, divers and search teams scoured the lake, but neither body ever turned up. Eventually, both the police and Coast Guard had to call off the search. In the weeks that followed, warnings were issued to every vessel traveling across the Great Lakes. But those precautions turned out to be unnecessary. That November brought no storms. They had arrived early that year, concentrated in one small region, and weeks ahead of schedule. Everyone understood what that meant. Those lost to the lake would never be recovered. When November came too soon, Gichigumi kept her dead. Every sailor knew it, and every sailor feared that month's arrival. Next chapter. 3 days after Halloween, Caleb Drayton slid behind the wheel of his Mustang and set a course for home. This time, for the first time in ages, it actually felt like home, not just the empty shell he returned to after his release from the hospital. Life had veered off its usual track, but in a surprisingly good way. It had only been a few days, but Caleb was confident he'd made the right choice. Something inside him had shifted, something that filled a long-standing void. As he stepped through the front door, Janet rushed to meet him. She wrapped her arms around him with desperate tenderness, as if she needed that moment to breathe. Maybe it wasn't her life on the line, but it was definitely her heart. Their relationship was still new, yet deep down, Janet already knew. Caleb was the man she had hoped for. The one to build a future with. Someone who would love her back, without fear or hesitation. Someone she could dream about starting a family with. That last part, that was her deepest wish. Caleb kissed her. For a brief moment, a memory flickered. He'd kissed someone else like this once. But this time, it felt genuine. Nearly 2 months later, John Lake was finally discharged from the hospital, still weak and moving slowly. He had been told not to overdo it and to take his recovery step by step. There were still weeks of physical therapy ahead. But for the past 2 months, he had fought tooth and nail to pull through. One thought had kept him going. The day after Halloween, just as the authorities officially closed the bizarre case involving his distant, enigmatic wife, something unexpected had occurred. The officer assigned to his investigation had become his girlfriend. And only a few hours after Caleb and Janet left the hospital, and while John lay in bed, racked with pain as his fractured bones healed, a visitor arrived. At first he thought it was a dream. A striking blonde woman stood beside him. "I think we got off to a bad start," she said softly. "I'm sorry I hurt you, but you really pissed me off." Then she added, "When you're out of here, if you still want to find me, go to the water and call my name." He assumed she was confused. Maybe she had the wrong man. No woman had ever hurt him like that before. Maybe it was just a dream. Later, John hobbled to his Mustang. His car had been sitting in long-term parking for weeks, and he had to use his credit card to get it out. He expected it not to start, but it fired up on the first try. He wasn't sure where he was going, he just drove. Eventually, the road carried him north, toward the small towns where his roots were. These weren't reservations, just quiet places where the old ways still lingered. He passed through a familiar village and saw a few familiar faces. "Hey, John, you back?" someone shouted. "I'm not sure," he replied. "Maybe." He got out and sat on a bench overlooking the open water. "November," he murmured. Then he laughed to himself. "I must be out of my mind for even thinking about it." As he chuckled, the lake rippled, and then she appeared. "Took you long enough," she said with a grin. "I just got out of the hospital," he replied. "Like the new look?" she asked, teasing. He smiled, stepping forward to embrace her. Try not to piss me off again, she warned, smirking. The end.